Everyone saw him every day, quietly pushing his cart, sweeping the marble floors of a towering corporate empire. To the powerful executives, he was invisible, just a black janitor in a world of millionaires. But one ordinary morning, when the CEO himself began to stumble, sweat and dismiss his own pain, everyone else laughed it off, too blinded by wealth and arrogance to notice. Everyone, except him. The man they ignored, overlooked and underestimated, would be the only one to recognize the silent warning signs. And in that moment, the janitor's watchful eyes would become the difference between life and death. The skyscraper of Harrison Global Enterprises gleamed against the city skyline, a symbol of untouchable power and wealth. Its offices were filled with polished shoes, expensive suits, and people who measured worth in millions. But hidden in the background, walking the same glossy halls every day, was Thomas, a middle-aged black janitor whose quiet presence rarely drew more than a passing glance. He kept his head down, worked diligently, and made sure every corner shined. To the executives, he was just staff. To the interns, he was invisible. Yet behind his calm eyes was a man who carried both wisdom and scars. He had lived through struggle, endured prejudice, and developed a sharp instinct for noticing what others ignored. At the top of this empire was Charles Harrison, the CEO, a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms across the world. Known for his charisma and relentless ambition, Charles was admired by many, but he carried himself with the kind of arrogance that came from years of unchecked privilege. His employees praised him, investors trusted him, but beneath the tailored suits, he had long ignored his own health. Thomas, while polishing the railings or collecting trash, often noticed the small things others missed. The tremor in Charles's hands, the way he sometimes paused to catch his breath, or the faint sheen of sweat that appeared even in air-conditioned halls. No one else seemed to care. To them, Charles was invincible. To Thomas, something felt dangerously wrong. What none of them knew was that these unnoticed details would soon unfold into a life-or-death moment, one that would change not just the CEO's fate, but the way everyone saw the man they had dismissed all along. Days at Harrison Global Enterprises always followed the same rhythm. Assistants carried coffee trays, executives rushed between glass-walled offices, and Charles Harrison commanded attention wherever he went. People laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, nodded at his opinions as if they were gospel, and treated his presence as though it was a gift. But when Thomas entered the room, silence fell, not the respectful kind, but the type that carried a quiet dismissal. Conversations rarely included him. Eyes slid past him as though he wasn't there. When he bent to pick up discarded papers or emptied the bins, people sometimes stepped around him like he was part of the furniture. One evening, after most of the staff had left, Thomas lingered to finish polishing the marble floors of the main lobby. Through the glass walls, he noticed Charles lingering in his office. The CEO was sitting at his desk, but his posture was slumped. His hand clutched at the edge of the table as if he was grounding himself against a wave of dizziness. For a moment, Charles pressed his fingers to his temple, closing his eyes against some invisible pain. Then, just as quickly, he straightened, adjusted his jacket, and walked out as if nothing had happened. Thomas said nothing. He knew better than to voice concern. In a place like this, a janitor's words carried no weight. If he spoke up, people would likely laugh, or worse, accuse him of overstepping. The next morning, however, the signs grew more alarming. Charles's steps were unsteady as he entered the building. His skin looked pale, almost gray, and sweat beaded along his hairline though the air was cool. Still, no one seemed to notice. Executives surrounded him with files and questions, competing for his attention, blind to his discomfort. Thomas's heart raced. He had seen these signs before. His late brother had displayed the same troubling symptoms before collapsing from a heart attack years ago. The thought chilled him. Was Charles on the same path? But when Thomas tried to linger nearby, subtly watching, he felt the sting of prejudice pierce deeper than ever. One of the junior managers scowled and snapped at him to keep moving. Another executive muttered under his breath, "Why is the janitor staring at the boss?" The message was clear. Thomas didn't belong in their conversations, nor in their world of power and influence. Yet Thomas couldn't shake the gnawing certainty in his gut. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and he was the only one who seemed to care enough to notice. The invisible man was about to face a choice: remain silent and safe in the shadows, or risk ridicule and rejection by stepping into the light. The boardroom buzzed with tension as executives gathered for the quarterly meeting. Charts flickered across the screen, voices overlapped, and the air smelled of expensive cologne and ambition. At the head of the table sat Charles Harrison, the powerful CEO, but his commanding presence seemed to waver. His hand trembled as he lifted a glass of water. The liquid sloshed, spilling onto the polished table. A nervous laugh rippled among the executives, but Thomas, who had been called in to discreetly mop the hallway floor, froze in alarm. Charles's face had drained of color, beads of sweat clung to his temples, his chest heaved, and then, suddenly, his eyes rolled back. The mighty CEO slumped sideways in his chair, gasping for breath. Panic erupted. Executives leapt to their feet, some shouting for help, others frozen in shock. No one moved toward him. Phones were fumbled with, but no one seemed to know what to do. No one except Thomas. Every instinct screamed that this was the moment. Without hesitation, he rushed into the room. Gasps followed him, as if his presence were more shocking than the emergency itself. One vice president barked at him to leave, but Thomas ignored the word. He dropped to his knees beside Charles, checking his pulse with a steady, practiced hand. He recognized the signs instantly, just as he had with his brother years ago. Time was running out. "Call emergency services now," he commanded, his voice stronger than anyone had ever heard it before. The room fell silent at the authority in his tone. For once, no one questioned him. Thomas tilted Charles onto the floor and began chest compressions. His arms pumped with relentless precision, each push fueled by both urgency and defiance. Defiance against the years of being unseen, unheard, and underestimated. The executives stood in stunned silence, watching the janitor they had ignored for years battle to keep their leader alive. With every compression, Thomas shattered the invisible walls that had kept him in the shadows. The life of the man who had everything now rested in the hands of the man who had nothing. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, but inside the boardroom, time felt suspended. Thomas's hands pressed rhythmically on the CEO's chest, sweat dripping from his brow. At last, Charles jerked, coughing violently, as air rushed back into his lungs. A wave of gasps and relieved cries filled the room. The paramedics stormed in moments later, taking over with efficiency. But every eye in that room stayed fixed on Thomas. The janitor, who was often overlooked, who walked invisible in the halls, had just accomplished what no millionaire, no vice president, no board member could. He had saved the man at the very top. As Charles was wheeled away, his trembling hand reached out, brushing Thomas's arm in a silent acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, but in that instant, walls built over years of pride and prejudice began to crumble. The following days brought whispers across the entire company. Executives who had once dismissed Thomas now replayed the moment he had taken charge. Employees spoke in hushed awe about the janitor who had seen what no one else did, who had noticed the signs, who had acted when everyone else froze. And when Charles returned weeks later, weaker but alive, the first public statement he made wasn't about quarterly profits or market strategies. It was about Thomas. He told the story of the janitor who saved his life. He demanded Thomas's name be known, his face remembered, and his courage honored. Promotions and opportunities followed, but more importantly, respect finally replaced dismissal. Yet for Thomas, the true victory wasn't in titles or recognition. It was in proving that worth is never tied to a uniform, a salary, or the color of one's skin. It is tied to the heart, the choices made in the defining moments, and the courage to act even when the world doubts you. Still, the image lingered, a boardroom full of the most powerful people in the city, paralyzed by fear, while the quiet janitor took control. It begged an unsettling question: how many others are ignored, unseen, underestimated, when they might just be the ones carrying the strength to save us all? Thomas walked the halls again, mop in hand, but now people saw him differently, not as just a janitor, not as just a black man, but as the man who reminded them all of the power of humanity. And perhaps that is the greatest truth. Sometimes, the people we least notice hold the ability to change, or even save, the lives of those who believe they need